welcome to the first ever episode of Trellis to Table, your podcast talking about growing hops, selling hops, and thinking about small farms and the bigger craft brewing industry. My name's Simon. As always, I'll be your host, and I'm super pumped to bring you our first episode with Mr. Steve Miller, the hop specialist at Cornell Cooperative Extension. After plenty of time prepping for this podcast, everyone recommended that I reach out to Steve, and it's such a treat to have talked with him, and we ended up talking for so long that it has actually been broken into 2 episodes. So this is the first of those 2 episodes. I hope you like it. If you find that Trellis to Table is the kind of podcast that you enjoy, please do subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or your podcasting software of choice. And of course, a review on iTunes is always appreciated. I have with me today Mr. Steve Miller, who many of you may have heard of already. He is the hop specialist for the Cornell Cooperative Extension in New York State. How's it going, Steve?
Great. How are you, Simon?
I'm doing great. I'm in the one non-air conditioned room in my house, I think.
Well, no noise then, right?
Exactly right. Can you tell me a little bit about you, Steve? About your story, your personal history?
Well, my background is I have a degree from the Forestry College in Syracuse originally, and a master's degree from Clemson University in South Carolina. And after I got my master's, I worked with the experiment station at Geneva for a few years on vegetable diseases, and then spent the last 3 decades working with commercial vegetables and horticulture in New York State with Cornell, and the last 5 years specifically with hop growers. So since all of a sudden we got an interest in people growing hops commercially, and I was hired to fill that need, at least for the time being anyway, to get things started.
Right. Very good. So you've been involved with this agricultural part of the Cornell community for a while. Can you talk a little bit about your transition into this full-time hops role?
Well, somebody wrote a grant. It was actually between Cooperative Extension here in Madison County and the Northeast Hop Alliance. Mm-hmm. And what was happening was there was so many people interested in getting information on growing hops that the few growers that were out there said they just couldn't spend any more time with people. That's not their job. Their job was to grow hops and not to be an educator. So right. A grant was written, and I was hired, and it was fairly easy transition for me because I have been working with commercial growers for a long time, and I think that's how we got this started. Really was the real lack out there isn't a lack of land. And not necessarily even a lack of money. It's more a lack of information and wanting to make sure that people who did start growing hops some of their risk was reduced as much as possible by making sure they had the information they needed. And I know the growers who have been in it for more than 10 years, they'll freely say that when they started there was no information and they made every mistake possible and are doing things differently now than they did 10, 15 years ago. Most of the industry that we have in New York, and I think in the Northeast and Midwest, most of those growers have planted in the last 3 or 4 years.
Wow!
If you look at the total acreage, we're up to about 300 acres in New York, and when I started, there were only 15 acres.
Whoa!
It's changed a lot, and it's pretty significant investment. We just had Michael Roy from Roy Farms out in Washington State here to speak to our growers for 3 intensive workshops, and that was sponsored by Brewery Omegon. And Michael said that when they look at the cost of putting in acres out there in Washington, they're looking at $50,000 an acre between the cost of the land, establishing the hops, and all the infrastructure that's needed to go with that. And I think that's pretty accurate when we look at here, just the cost of establishing, putting in the trellis and establishing the plants and getting things, the land prepared. We're really in the $15,000 to $20,000 an acre range. So
oh wow, okay.
That does not count the cost of the land or tractors or buildings or anything else. So I think it's a pretty. It is much like putting in a vineyard.
Can I ask you 2 questions about that?
Sure.
In talking to other people, and even in an interview that you had a couple of years ago, it seems like this price per acre can vary really widely. So my first question is, why do you think it is people have such different ideas as to this cost per acre to set up? And my second question is, what goes into that? Like, can you break down that dollar amount a little bit for me?
Yeah, I think what goes into it and why people have differing ideas is because, I quite honestly, I think some of it's wishful thinking.
Okay.
I can do all the work myself. I can source all the materials myself. I'm going to cut corners and try to do it as cheaply as possible. And I really discourage people from thinking that way because when we look at commercial farms out west, these are farms that have been in business for a long time, and they know exactly what it takes to grow a crop of hops and make money at it. And I think people here have not been doing it long enough. They haven't been exposed to it and aren't totally sure of what all their costs are going to be. But certainly, just putting up the trellis alone is in the $6,000 to $8,000 range just for the materials. That doesn't count the labor.
Right.
So now you've got another $5,000 at least in the plants, and a couple $1,000 for drip irrigation. And again, that does not count putting in a pond or drilling wells or anything else. That's just for the materials. So we're kind of people are not counting all the things that they really should be counting to do it right.
I see.
And I think growing hops is an expensive venture. It's labor intensive, and it should not be done in a situation where you don't have the best of soils and water availability and the best site. We have a lot of land available in the Northeast.
Yes.
And really should only be growing hops on land that is going to offer the best chance of success. Can
you characterize what that would look like?
Well, it should be good, well-drained soil that's at least 4 feet deep. And by well-drained, it doesn't necessarily have to be sandy, but you don't ever want to have standing water. Hops like to have water available through irrigation, but they do not withstand wet feet. They need lots of oxygen for the root system, so they really do best on a good, well-drained soil.
Okay.
We also need to have good air drainage. We're in a part of the country where we have a lot of rainfall, much more than they do in the Pacific Northwest where they grow hops, which is more of a desert. And because of that rainfall, we are susceptible to a little more disease problems than they are, and again, wanting to make sure that everything is just right if we're going to be planting a crop like hops. So a good a site that has a little bit of slope. Often people hear that they need to have water, so they think they need to set up the hops near the water. And the last place you want to be is down in the bottom of a valley where you've got a pond or a river or a stream where you've got a lot of humidity.
Okay.
That humidity at night in July and August can really cause some issues for downy mildew in particular.
Right.
So having access to water, but not necessarily being near water. And then, of course, full sun.
Mm-hmm.
So good air drainage, good soil drainage, and full sun. Those are the really key factors there for siting a hop yard.
You mentioned downy mildew.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen, like, what are the major pest or sort of fungal problems that you've seen, especially sort of around upstate New York?
Well, as far as fungal problems, the two biggest that are out there for hops are powdery mildew and downy mildew. And we've been lucky so far that we haven't had any powdery mildew in the state.
Mm-hmm.
I think eventually we will probably get some one way or the other, especially since we're planting a lot of hops. And many people are sourcing their propagation material from the Pacific Northwest, where they are likely to eventually bring some powdery mildew in with that material.
Right.
And we really discourage people from buying rhizomes unless they're absolutely sure that they're clean. The downy mildew is something that we've had in the state and in the Northeast for a long time, and I think we're always going to have it. And it's a matter of managing for it, both through cultural practices and variety selection, as well as making sure that we have access to some fungicides that are helpful in keeping that disease from really getting out of hand.
Okay. And insect-wise, anything notable?
Insect pests, we have some of the same things that they have out west. Two-spotted spider mite and hop aphids are two of the major pests that they have and we have. But we also will run across potato leafhopper, which does not overwinter in the north, but comes up on the winds from the south each spring, goes into alfalfa fields primarily, and when they mow the hay, a lot of those, a lot of those leafhoppers then leave the alfalfa and go into some hop fields that are near them. They seem to like hops and can do a lot of damage to the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, we see a lot of Japanese beetles, and there's another beetle called a rose chafer that's similar, and they both feed on the leaves. We have some Lepidoptera butterfly pests of hops. So one is called the hop merchant, and it's also known as the eastern comma. It's it's called a comma because it has a comma shape,
awesome
figure on it. And there's another one called the question mark, and people usually think this is a joke that I'm making this up, but it's not.
Those are real. Is there an exclamation point?
Those two butterflies the larvae do feed on the leaves of hops.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears here a little bit. Let's say that I want to, over the next calendar year, start a hop farm. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me, what should I do today? What should I do in 6 months? How do I prepare myself as well as I possibly can for this endeavor?
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, is preparing not only yourself but the property for that endeavor, because there's so much enthusiasm about craft beer and people wanting to be part of this market, and they often think it's the same as well. If there's people who want corn, I'll go out and plant corn, and I can do that right away. Mm-hmm. Hops are kind of a long-term thing and require a lot of preparation before you put anything in the ground. So getting information on and looking for the absolute best site, getting a soil test from your USDA office or your local extension office on from the farm, the land that you currently own, or if you're looking for land, then start looking at the soil maps to see what is available out there. Again, you really should be looking at only the best site. Then what usually happens is I have people call me in March, April, May, June. I want to plant hops, so when can I do it? And they really should be looking at planting next year instead of this year, because you want to prepare that land and make sure that it's relatively weed-free, especially if weeds that are really noxious perennial weeds like goldenrod and brambles and quackgrass, things like that. You want to reduce that weed population because hops are a perennial themselves, and that means that many of the herbicides that you might use to control perennial weeds are also going to kill the hops. So those things are not available to use like you would on a woody crop like grapes or apples. So that's where the major difference is making sure you've planted something on that land this year, whether it's clover or buckwheat or corn or something that's going to reduce the weed population and loosen up the ground and prepare it. Many people think, well, we've got lots of vacant land around New York State, and we'll use that vacant land to grow hops. And I can tell you, most of the vacant land out there is vacant because it's not suitable for growing corn or soybeans or something else, and that means it's probably also not suitable for growing hops. So you want to take the best land that you possibly can and prepare that. I would go to as many seminars and look at the websites that UVM has a lot of information, and we have a lot of information on the Northeast Hop Alliance, northeasthopalliance.org. And people can become members of that. And there's a lot of information. You can go to that website without being a member and check out the resources and newsletters. That's where I put my newsletter every month for people to be able to read.
And what's that website again, so people can check out your newsletter?
It's northeasthopalliance.org.
And can you tell me a little bit more about the Northeast Hop Alliance?
Yeah, it used to be called NEHA for short, NEHA, and that was started probably about 10, 15 years ago, mostly by just a handful of growers and a lot of people who are interested in the history of hops and hop barns and various things like that. That's changed a lot, and because of the number of people growing hops now, the great majority of the members there now are actually growers and not just people of interest. So it's not a cooperative. They do some bulk cooperative buying, purchases of materials like the core twine that's used to grow hops on, and those kind of things. So being a member, there's quite a few benefits, but it's not a cooperative in that they pull their product together and sell it. It's what's called a Growers Association. And there's chapters in New England, and then New York and Pennsylvania, and then the kind of the Mid-Atlantic is Maryland and Virginia and down that way.
Cool. So it's a growing concern.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I work with a group of educators like myself that are in about a dozen other states. We've got people in Michigan and Ohio and North Carolina, Maine, everywhere that we have some conference calls that we talk about issues and we have some meetings together and look at what the industry needs are for whether it's developing new varieties or pest management, what's happening with fertility. We talk talk together about those kind of things regularly, and that's been very useful to help get that kind of information spread out to the growers.
So, in your opinion, when you meet with and observe, especially new farmers and growing practices in your time with the Cooperative Extension, what do you think people are really getting right? Like, what are people doing correctly?
Well, first of all, I guess I would say that the people who have been growing apples or grapes or vegetables or some other crop like that commercially, they really are at a great advantage over people who are starting out from scratch. They have a base of knowledge, they have equipment, they've got labor, access to labor, and so they have many things that if you or I were just to go out and say, I want to plant 5 acres of hops from scratch, well, I've got some land, but that's all I have.
Right.
These other people have a big advantage, and so it is a little more difficult to just start out without having that farm experience and access to labor and equipment.
Right.
That doesn't mean they can't be successful, but it is a little more difficult for people like that to get going on this.
Sure, I believe it. So you started in this position 5 years ago, you said?
Yes.
And you said there are some hop growers who have been growing in New York as long as 10 years.
Back to about 2000.
Wow. So in this time period, how have things changed? Why do you think there are more people attracted to hops as a crop?
Well, I think the big thing is that there's a great interest in craft beer on the part of the consumers.
Yes.
We are seeing new breweries starting up all the time, and we've got over 200 craft breweries in New York State now. So that means a lot to people, knowing that there's a market. Because before, if somebody wanted to get into growing hops, they had to compete with farms that were 500 or 1,000 acres or more, and that was just not really possible. Now we've got a lot of smaller breweries that can purchase hops on a smaller scale.
Right.
They're not necessarily buying, 30 tons or 100 tons of hops. And so that's created some opportunities. There's also New York State passed what's called the Farm Brewery Law that went into effect in 2013.
Yes.
And in that case, that created a situation where people with that license had to purchase hops and grains grown in New York. So it started out at 20% of the hops that went into a beer had to be grown in New York, and that's going to increase to 60% by January 2019, and increases to 90% by January 2023.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. And so I think those two things, are certainly helping. But ultimately, it is the fact that consumers are more interested in craft beer, quality beer, diversity in beer, and the growers are seeing an opportunity because there's brewers out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you see a large number of farm breweries?
We started out with 0 in January 2013, and we're up to 85 farm breweries in New York State just in 2 years.
Whoa, 85?
85. And then we have another 140 breweries that have regular licenses, and I think it means there's a total of about 220 breweries licensed in New York State now.
That's awesome. That's really exciting.
Yeah. And so many of these breweries might be doing 1,000 to 5,000 barrels a year, and that means they can purchase some of their inputs on a smaller scale. But we've got some bigger breweries that
Mm-hmm.
are buying those New York State hops as well. I know Saranac and Utica, Omegon just came out with their Hop State beer that is 100%, New York State grown hops. And I know that there's a number of other breweries that are using New York State hops and featuring beers that are 100% like that. So they're not necessarily farm breweries. They recognize that there's a value there. They want to try out the hops and see how they might be different from some hops that they've been purchasing already. So we just want to be part of the market. I don't think anybody expects that we're going to take up all of the market.
Right.
If we can have a healthy part of the market being used here in New York, I think that would be great.